All right, today's the day. We're going to finish the book. We have 22 and 23 left to read. They're both short chapters. I don't know what you're going to think about this ending, so let's get to it. Yesterday and the day before, we read about how Jonas was unhappy with the community, especially after he determines what release means. Um, he and the giver come up with a plan where he's going to escape, and he's going to try to release the memories back in the community to change things. Before they can put that plan into place, we find out that Gabe is going to be released. And so now the giver is, uh, not the giver, sorry. Now Jonas is no longer sticking with that plan. In 21, he just like makes a run for it because he feels like he has to get out of the community as quickly as possible, and he takes Gabe with him because he's trying to save him. So yesterday they'd made it out of the community, and there were search planes looking for them. In 21, we ended with, where is it? Finally, there was an entire day and night when they did not come at all. And we're talking about the search planes. It seems like they've stopped looking for Jonas and Gabe. And remember, they're on a bicycle and they're trying to get away from the community. We pick up with 22. Now the landscape was changing. It was a subtle change, hard to identify at first. The road was narrower and bumpy, apparently no longer tended to by the road crews. It was harder suddenly to balance on the bike as the front wheel wobbled over stones and ruts. One night Jonas fell when the bike jolted to a sudden stop against a rock. He grabbed instinctively for Gabriel, and the new child, strapped tightly in his seat, was uninjured, only frightened when the bike fell to its side. But Jonas's ankle was twisted, and his knees were scraped and raw, and blood seeped through his torn trousers. Painfully he righted himself and the bike, and he reassured Gabe. Tentatively he began to ride now in the daylight. He had forgotten to fear the searchers, who seemed to have diminished into the past. But now there were new fears, an unfamiliar landscape that held hidden, unknown perils. Trees became more numerous, and the forests beside the road were dark and thick with mystery. They saw streams more frequently now and stopped often to drink. Jonas carefully washed his injured knee, wincing as he rubbed the raw flesh. The constant ache of his swollen ankle eased as he soaked it occasionally in cold water that rushed along the roadside gullies. He was newly aware that Gabriel's safety depended entirely upon his own continued strength. They saw their first waterfall, and for the first time wildlife. "Plane! Plane!" Gabriel called, and Jonas turned swiftly into the trees, though he had not seen a plane in days, and did not hear an aircraft engine now. When the bicycle was stopped in the shrubbery, and he turned to grab Gabe, he saw the small, chubby arm pointing up toward the sky. Terrified, he looked up, but it was not a plane at all. Though he'd never seen one before, he identified it from the fading memories. The giver had given them to him often. It was a bird. So as he's getting farther from the community, the memories that he got from the giver are starting to fade from his mind because they're going out to the community that he left behind. Soon there were many birds along the way, soaring overhead, calling. They saw a deer, and once beside the road, looking at them curiously and unafraid, a small reddish-brown creature with a thick tail, whose name Jonas did not know. He slowed the bike, and they stared at one another until the creature turned away and disappeared into the woods. So a small reddish-brown creature with a big tail. If we're thinking very small, that could be a squirrel. If we're thinking a little bigger, it could be a fox, might be something else. All of this was new to him. After the life of sameness and predictability, he was awed by the surprises that lay beyond each curve of the road. He slowed the bike again and again to look with wonder at the wildflowers and to enjoy the thwarty warble of a new bird nearby, or merely to watch the way the wind shifted in the leaves of the trees. During his 12 years of the community, he had never felt such simple moments of exquisite happiness. But there was a desperate fear building in him now as well. The most relentless of his new fears was that they would starve. Now they had left the cultivated fields behind them, and it was almost impossible to find food. They finished the meager store of potatoes and carrots that they had saved from the last agricultural area, and now they were always hungry. Jonas knelt by a stream and tried without success to catch a fish with his hands. Frustrated, he threw rocks into the water, knowing even as he did so that it was useless. Finally, in desperation, he fashioned a makeshift net, looping the strands of Gabriel's blanket around a curved stick, and after countless tries, the net yielded 2 flopping, silvery fish. Methodically, Jonas hacked them into pieces with a sharp rock and fed the raw shreds to himself and Gabriel, and they ate some berries and tried without success to catch a bird. At night, while Gabriel slept beside him, Jonas lay awake, tortured by hunger, and he remembered his life in the community where meals were delivered to the dwellings each and every day. He tried to use his flagging power of his memory to recreate meals and manage brief, tantalizing banquets with huge roasted meats, birthday parties with thick frosted cakes, and lush fruits picked and eaten, sun-warmed and dripping from the trees. But when the memory glimpses subsided, he was left with the gnawing, painful emptiness. Jonas remembered suddenly and grimly the time in his childhood when he had been chastised for misusing a word. The word had been starving. You have never been starving, he had been told. You will never be starving. Now he was. If he stayed in the community, he would not be. It was as simple as that. Once he had yearned for choice. Then he had had a choice, and he had made the wrong one, the choice to leave. And now he was starving. But if he'd stayed, his thoughts continued. If he'd stayed, he would have starved in other ways. He would have lived a life hungry for feelings, for color, for love. And for Gabriel, there would have been no life at all. So there really had been no choice. It became a struggle to ride the bicycle, as Jonas weakened from lack of food, and he realized at the same time that he was encountering something he had for a long time yearned to see: hills. His sprained ankle throbbed as he forced the pedal downward in an effort that was almost beyond him. The weather was changing. It rained for 2 days, and Jonas had never seen rain, though he had experienced it often in the memories. He had liked those rains, enjoyed the new feeling of it, but this was different. He and Gabriel became cold and wet, and it was hard to get dry, even when the sunshine occasionally followed. Gabriel had not cried during the long, frightening journey, but now he did. He cried because he was hungry and cold and terribly weak, and Jonas cried too for the same reasons. And another reason as well. He wept because he was afraid that he could not save Gabriel. He no longer cared about himself. So we're at the end of 22. Things are not going well. Jonas and Gabe are outside of the community, but they have no food, they have no shelter. Jonas is really tired, they see no end in sight. It's not going well. 23. Jonas felt more and more certain that the destination lay ahead of him, very near now, in the night that was approaching. None of his senses confirmed it. He saw nothing ahead except the endless ribbon of the road unfolding in twisting narrow curves. He heard no sound ahead, and yet he felt that elsewhere was not far away. But he had little hope left that he would be able to reach it. His hope diminished further when the sharp, cold air began to blur and thicken with swirling white. Gabriel, wrapped in his inadequate blanket, was hunched, shivering and silent in his little seat. Jonas stopped the bike wearily, lifted the child down, and realized with heartbreak how cold and weak Gabe had become. Standing in the freezing mound that was thickening around his numb feet, Jonas opened his own tunic. Gabriel held Gabriel to his bare chest and tied the torn, dirty blanket around them both. Gabriel moved feebly against him and whimpered briefly into the silence that surrounded them. Dimly, from a nearly forgotten perception as blurred as the substance itself, Jonas recalled what this whiteness was. "It's called snow, Gabe," Jonas whispered softly. "Snowflakes. They fall down from the sky. They're beautiful." There was no response from the child, who had once been so curious and alert. Jonas looked down through the dusk at the little head against his chest. Gabriel's curly hair was matted and filthy, and there were tear stains outlined on the dirt of his pale cheeks. His eyes were closed. Jonas watched as a snowflake drifted down and was caught briefly for a moment's sparkle in the tiny fluttering lashes. Wearily he remounted his bicycle. A steep hill loomed ahead. In the best conditions, the hill would have been difficult, a demanding ride, but now the rapidly deepening snow obscured the narrow road and made the ride impossible. His front wheel moved forward imperceptibly as he pushed on the pedals with his numb, exhausted legs, but the bicycle stopped, and it wouldn't move. He got off and let the bike drop sideways into the snow. For a moment, he thought how easy it would be to drop beside it himself, and to let himself and Gabriel slide into the softness of the snow and the darkness of the night and the warm comfort of sleep. But he'd come this far. He must go on. The memories had fallen behind him now, escaping from his protection to return to the people of the community. Were there any left at all? Could he hold on to a last bit of warmth? Did he have the strength to give? Could Gabriel still receive? He pressed his hand to Gabriel's back and tried to remember sunshine. For a moment it seemed that nothing came to him, that his power was completely gone. Then it flickered suddenly, and he felt tiny tongues of heat begin to creep across his frozen feet and legs. He felt his face begin to glow, and the tense, cold skin of his arms and hands relax. For a fleeting second, He felt that he wanted to keep it for himself, to let himself bathe in the sunlight, unburdened by anything or anyone. But the moment passed, and was followed by an urge, a need, a passionate yearning to share the warmth with the one person left for him to love. Aching from the effort, he forced the memory of warmth into the thin, shivering body in his arms. Gabriel stirred. For a moment they both were bathed in the warmth and renewed strength as they stood hugging each other in the snow. Jonas began to walk up the hill. The memory was agonizingly brief, and he trudged no more than a few yards through the night, and it was gone, and they were cold again. But now his mind was alert. Warming himself ever so briefly had shaken away the lethargy and resignation and restored his will to survive. He began to walk faster on feet that he could no longer feel. But the hill was treacherously steep, and he was impeded by the snow and his own lack of strength, and he didn't make it very far before he stumbled and fell forward. On his knees, unable to rise, Jonas tried a second time. His consciousness grasped a wisp of another warm memory, and he tried desperately to hold it there, to enlarge it, to pass it to Gabriel. His spirits and strength lifted with the momentary warmth, and he stood. And again Gabriel stirred against him as he began to climb. But the memory faded, leaving him colder than before. If only he had time to receive more warmth from the giver before he escaped. Maybe there would be more left for him now. But there was no purpose in if-onlys. His entire concentration now had to be on moving his feet, warming Gabriel and himself, and going forward. He climbed, stopped, warmed them both briefly with a tiny scrap of memory that seemed certainly to be all he had left. The top of the hill seemed so far away. He did not know what lay beyond, but there was nothing left to do but continue, so he trudged upward. He approached the summit of the hill at last, and something began to happen. He was not warmer. If anything, he felt more numb and more cold. He was not less exhausted. On the contrary, his steps were leaden, and he could barely move his freezing, tired legs. But he began, suddenly, to feel happy. He began to recall happy times. He remembered his parents and his sister. He remembered his friends, Asher and Fiona. He remembered the giver. Memories of joy flooded through him. He reached the place where the hill crested, and he could feel the ground under the snow-covered feet become level. It would not be uphill anymore. "We're almost there, Gabriel," he whispered, feeling quite uncertain without knowing why. "I remember this place, Gabe." And it was true. But it was not a grasping of thin, burdensome recollection. This was different. This was something that he could keep. It was a memory of his own. He hugged Gabriel and rubbed him briskly, warming him to keep him alive. The wind was bitterly cold. The snow swirled, blurring his vision, but somewhere ahead, through the blinding snowstorm, he knew there was warmth and light. Using his final strength and the special knowledge that was deep inside of him, Jonas found the sled that was waiting for them at the top of the hill, and numbly his hands fumbled for the rope. He settled himself on the sled, and he hugged Gabe close. The hill was steep, but the snow was powdery and soft, and he knew that this time there would be no ice, no fall, no pain. Inside his freezing body his heart surged with hope, and they started down. Jonas felt himself losing consciousness, and with his whole being he willed himself to stay upright atop the sled, clutching Gabriel, keeping him safe. The runners sliced through the snow, and the wind whipped at his face as they sped in a straight line through an incision that seemed to lead to a final destination. The place that he had always felt was waiting, the elsewhere that held their future and their past. He forced his eyes open as they went downward sliding, and all at once he could see lights. He recognized them now. He knew they were shining through the windows of rooms that were red and blue, and that they were red and blue and yellow lights that twinkled from the trees in places where families created and kept memories, where they celebrated love. Downward, faster and faster, and suddenly he was aware with a certain joy that below, ahead, they were waiting for him, and that they were waiting too for the baby. And for the first time, he heard something that he knew to be music. He heard people singing. And behind him, across the vast distances of space and time, from a place that he had left, he thought he heard music too, but perhaps it was only an echo. That's it. That's all there is. Lois Lowry, when she wrote this book, left the ending purposely ambiguous, which means she left it purposely unknown. She didn't want you to have a definite answer of how the story ended. She wanted you, the reader, to make up your mind about what you thought the ending meant and what you thought happened at the end of the story. I have my own theory. I've read this book a whole bunch. So if you want to know what I think the ending means and you want to know more about the sequels, watch the Other Ed puzzle that's posted, where it talks about the sequels and companion books to The Giver. and it also is going to give you a theory about what the ending of this story means. So if you're a remote person, send Mrs. Myers or I, whoever is your teacher, an email and let us know what you think, because the ending is always controversial. Some people love that it's this way. Some people are really upset that it's this way. And I'd love to know what you think. So, all right, that's it. We have now finished the book. We will start the movie tomorrow. Watch the Other Ed Puzzle for more info about both the book and the movie and the sequels, etc. I hope you like The Giver. There's just so much to say about this book. We could just keep talking about it, but I'll end there. Have a great day. Enjoy the movie this week.